After 4 weeks of bad news for the government, we're now seeing the media party mobilising to protect the COVID Queen. We've had attacks on the husband of Judith Collins and multiple media scolds writing tut-tutting columns telling us off for a variety of sins that include daring to ask hard questions of the Prime Minister or even mocking her with internet memes. I don't think I've ever seen a more precious Prime Minister who seeks to have many in the media defend her. Ironically, the same media she no longer deigns to court when international media give her a much more sycophantic hearing. Have you noticed too how she no longer fronts the daily press conferences from the podium of truth? She only does good news, and so it falls to Chris Hipkins to weather the storm of media questioning over the latest mishap in handling the COVID crisis. The Prime Minister wants all the plaudits and none of the criticism. That's not leadership. It stands to reason that if you take all the credit for the good things, then you are also responsible for all the bad things too. The Prime Minister has fallen for the age-old trap that most politicians fall for in their career. Believing your own spin. That's why they still think Kiwi Build was something other than an abject failure. That's why they had hundreds of working groups who did nothing and produced even less. Every single one of their major promises at the last election has been a failure. Kiwi Build, light rail and child poverty. Why then do so many think the COVID Queen has done a grand job when all evidence and previous promises and policies suggest otherwise? It's an enigma, but an enigma that will be cracked as more and more people suffer the economic riptides destroying jobs and businesses. Campaigning on what you've done seems to be a particularly barren field to plough. Voters want solutions, and those solutions need to be achievable to get us through the economic catastrophe that has befallen us. That is where Labour will suffer. Their past performance is ordinary at best and utter failure at the worst. Can we really trust them to keep us moving? I'm Cam Slater, and this is Insight Politics. Andrea Vance has a sycophantic Karen-esque article in Stuff this week about how terrible it is to call our Prime Minister by a diminutive nickname like Cindy. She expends a whole column filled with tut-tutting, finger-wagging and scowly words, all defending Jacinda Ardern. Ardern herself must be one of the most precious leaders we've ever had, always getting others, mostly men, but in this case a Karen-haired Andrea Vance to defend her. Apparently, we are told by the scold Andrea Vance, Jacinda Ardern doesn't like being called Cindy, even by her family. Which is a lie, of course, because in October 2017, Audrey Young wrote this line in her article about the new Prime Minister. Thursday's show ended the chocolate box scenes of a couple of gorgeous nieces walking hand in hand with Auntie Cindy and Uncle Clark Gayford up Parliament steps. Apparently, it is also condescending and paternalistic to call her Cindy, which is highly ironic because that is precisely how she treats the entire country every time she stands at the podium of truth and tells us all lies. Andrea Vance, the girl from Northern Ireland, who cut her reporter's teeth at the now-defunct News of the World, also gives us a little history lesson, which is also wrong. She states that Sir John Key was never Johnny, Sir Bill English was not called Billy, no Jimmy Bolger, Robbie Muldoon or Mikey Moore. She forgets that the left called John Key Shonky and wrote songs about him being a filthy moneylender and always made mention of his corporate banking days to riff off the old anti-Semitic trope that Jews were evil bankers. Their favourite band wrote songs that talked about killing the PM, .com got his audience to chant "Fuck John Key," their favourite artist spoke about raping his children, and they Google bombed him. Bill English, of course, is William English, and so his usual name was in fact already a diminutive. Same for Jim Bolger, whose first name was James, but was nicknamed Spud. But the most hilarious of all was suggesting that Robert Muldoon was never called a nickname like Robbie. She again forgets that Rob was the diminutive. His crowds of supporters were called Rob's Mob, and his other nickname was Piggy. ASB even had a piggy bank for kids to save coins. And Mike Moore was in fact Michael Moore. All of her examples are pathetic, and her point was missed because apart from John Key, they were all already called by their diminutives. So it seems that when Andrea Vance isn't clutching at the coattails of Nikki Hager, she is writing scolding columns that ignore history and the poor behaviour of the left towards conservative politicians. Politicians get nicknames. Only people like Andrea Vance get their knickers in a bunch over it. Does she forget that Michael Joseph Savage was called Mickey, John Marshall was called Jack, Norman Kirk was called Norm or Big Norm, Sidney Holland was called Sid, and Richard Seddon was called King Dick? So what's in a name? Some people call the Prime Minister Cindy. So what? There are worse things to be called, like clueless, ignorant, lightweight, condescending, out of her depth, gauche, inept, and thick. Andrea Vance needs to have a long, hard think about what she just wrote and see if she can figure out why nicknames are used. Then she can have a think about why we think she's a sycophantic hack. It's okay for Jacinda Ardern to call Donald Trump names and giggle at Winston Peters' Simon Bridges impressions. As one of my readers pointed out, I loved my Cindy, her clothes, shoes and accessories. Boy, did she have style. No tarty earrings, no slippers, no ankle boots, no puffed sleeve blouses, no floral fox. The similarities end with plastic, too skinny, and a perfectly useless boyfriend. So it's Ardern for me. Of course, Andrea Vance, without even a shred of self-awareness of the outlet she writes her scolding articles for, ignores the nasty on their own pages towards Judith Collins, with cartoonists regularly depicting her as some sort of sociopathic murderer.
Cindy, oh Cindy, Cindy, don't let me down.
Some readers fondly remember the song by Vince Martin and the Terriers, which went, Cindy, oh Cindy, don't let me down. But in recent times, that's exactly what the current Cindy has done. She's let us down, whether Andrea Vance likes it or not. Another reader comments, there seems to be a lefty expectation that if you're a woman, you must worship at the altar of Jacinda. I cannot stand her and have felt this way since before the last election. So as a she, I'll call her Cindy if I want. It's a tad more civil than some of the things I've called her in my head. Somehow I think Andrea Vance's scolding article will have fallen on deaf ears of a public who are sick and tired of being lectured, hectored and spoken to like naughty children by Cindy Ardern.
In every wave, her lips kiss every breeze. Her loving arms reach out for me through calm and stormy seas. At night I pace the lonely deck, caressed by memories. Cindy, oh Cindy, Cindy, don't let me down.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
And speaking of being let down by the Prime Minister, there are many of those, but especially the children of New Zealand. The Prime Minister has said many times that we should know her by her deeds. 3 long years ago, during the 2017 election campaign, Jacinda Ardern announced ambitious goals to reduce child poverty. She said at the time, because when we hold ourselves to account, you can hold us to account. She also made herself the Minister of Child Poverty Reduction. So how has she done on this key area that drove her to enter politics? How does she measure up against the very benchmark she said would be used to hold her to account. Well, not so good. It really shouldn't be a surprise that yet another key election plank of Labour at the last election has ended the same way as Kiwi Build and light rail to Auckland Airport. Many of the key measures have worsened. The official stats tell the story. No demonstrable difference despite special legislation and billions of extra dollars being spent on it. Rates of low income have generally declined from 2017 to 2018, but most of these decreases were not statistically significant. Material hardship rates showed no significant change from 2007-18 to 2018-19. Percentage of children living in households that experienced material hardship rose, meaning an extra 4,100 children were worse off. These are the measures that the Prime Minister said would allow her to be held to account. Like Kiwi Build and light rail, they have under-delivered yet again. An NCEA not achieved. A fail in old school terms. Even the charts show that child poverty reduction was more marked under national. Little wonder that the Jobsworths at UNICEF have found this government, and by extension the Minister responsible for child poverty reduction, Jacinda Ardern, wanting. The annual UNICEF Worlds of Influence report card released last week showed that New Zealand is one of the worst places in the developed world to be a child, ranking 35th out of the 41 richest countries surveyed, which include OECD countries and the countries that make up the European Union. The report painted a grim picture for children living in New Zealand under the leadership of a woman who proclaimed that the reason for her entering politics was to make things better for children. The report states that out of 41 EU and OECD countries, New Zealand ranks 35th in child well-being outcomes. New Zealand has the second highest obesity rate in the OECD, and more than 1 in 3 children are obese or overweight. Meanwhile, only 64.6% of 15-year-olds in New Zealand have basic proficiency in reading and maths. Now, personally, I don't find anything emanating from UNICEF is very useful, but I'm not the one claiming that my number one priority was child poverty, which has gone up. That's the minister responsible, Jacinda Ardern. But Ardern came out and tried to blame the bad figures on national. But the lead author of the report called out Ardern and pointed out that these reports are annual, and this is her third one with no demonstrable change, and in some respects, negative change. That means this report is on Ardern and no one else. Yet again, we can see that nothing Ardern ever says can be believed. She is just a collection of bumper sticker slogans. Nothing is ever delivered. And to think Labour's election slogan is "Let's keep moving." Clearly on child poverty, moving means treading water. Know us by our deeds, she says. Well, those deeds only ever end in failure, and I fail to see why we should keep embracing failure.
Think of the children. Won't somebody please think of the children?
The government is constantly at pains to tell us, our one source of truth, that there is no link to the border for the ongoing outbreak of the Chinese plague that saw Auckland locked down a second time. I think they're being cute with the truth and baffling people with sciencing. Let's look at the facts. The strain has been identified as B1.1.1. Director General of Health Dr. Ashley Bloomfield pointed out that the samples had strong links to the United Kingdom and Australia. In any case, all occurrences of B1.1.1 before appearing in New Zealand were from overseas. The government claims that no one has had that particular strain previously at the border in testing. But we know that hundreds of people were not tested on day 3 at the border quarantine facilities. We also know that hundreds have come through the border with no testing whatsoever prior to their so-called crackdown on June 23 as a result of others escaping the border without testing. And more than 100 people were transferred between Auckland and Christchurch without being tested at all. Plenty of others were released from isolation for compassionate reasons. And prior to compulsory testing at the border, they only tested those with symptoms. Testing the community has likewise been rationed by limiting to testing only those with symptoms. 80% of people who contract the Chinese plague are asymptomatic. This outbreak can only have come through the border. It can't have come from anywhere else. Just because they can't link it to the thousands of people coming through the border doesn't mean that it didn't come from there. And when you realise that, and ignore the spin that testing hasn't proved that it did come from the border, then you realise that the border provisions, which the government is in charge of, have failed, which means that the 2 recent deaths are on the government's shoulders. It's not a mystery at all as to where B1.1.1 came from. It came from overseas, and it came through our borders after the Prime Minister told us we had the best border controls in the world. They were responsible for the border, and so they're responsible for this outbreak. Now, could we please stop saying it's a mystery and start looking critically at the failures this government has presided over? She may have a communications degree from Waikato University, but the voters are sick of her weasel words and sermonising from the podium of truth. We need plain speaking, and we need the truth. I'm reliably informed that the Prime Minister does indeed know the source of the transmission, but is refusing to say what it is. She has even refused to inform her coalition partner, Winston Peters. Could it be that the truth will prove their lies, that they don't know where it came from and that it came through the border? That will mean the outbreak is on her, but then smart people already know that.
Faces filled with joy and cheer, what a magical time of year. Howdy ho, it's Weasel Stomping Day. Put your Viking helmet on, spread that mayonnaise on the lawn. Don't you know it's Weasel Stomping Day? All the little girls and boys love that wonderful crunching noise.
You'll know what this day's about
when you stomp a weasel's guts right out. So come along and have a laugh. Snap their weaselly spines in half. Grab your boots and stomp your cares away. Hip hip hooray, it's Weasel Stomping Day.
I awarded last week's Political Weasel Award to James Shaw because of his weaselly behaviour in awarding $11.5 million to the Green School in Taranaki. Just to recap, there was a plan to fund a Womble school that was so cunning that you could put a tail on it and call it a weasel. Unfortunately, the brilliant strategist who hatched this plan and promoted it forgot that his own party has a policy opposing the funding of private schools or indeed any subsidies to private schools. No matter, he advocated and pushed for over $11 million of state money to fund a Womble school that charges $24,000 per annum for liberal elite Kiwi students and $46,000 per annum for their woke international counterparts. It certainly helped it was called the Green School and it was a shovel-ready project. James Shaw got caught out and said he's sorry for signing off on it. This week, however, it was revealed that not only did he advocate for the Green School, but that he also hosted the school's founders to a meeting in Wellington, and also that he actually blackmailed the government into funding the school against Treasury's advice. Worse still, he put the blackmail in writing. Quote, Minister Shaw won't sign this briefing of infrastructure projects until the Green School in Taranaki is incorporated, the email dated August 7 said. Naked, venal, partisan, vegan, pork barrel politics. That's the only way to describe such scurrilous and hypocritical behaviour. Of course, he's resisted calls for him to resign, and so he is confirmed as a member of the Axis of Weasel with his second nomination for the award. We've had another week of bad news for the government, with border woes continuing, 2 more deaths from the Chinese plague, and James Shaw's blackmailing of the government in favour of a Womble school. Little wonder then that Labour rolled out a hit job on the husband of Judith Collins, led by a former Chief of Staff and Union bother boy Neil Jones. It didn't matter that families are usually not the ones targeted. They aren't elected after all. Labour has never really let that stop them anyway. They've constantly attacked and in many cases defamed David Wong-Tung, especially David Parker. So when he shared a few memes on social media, the gloves came off. This was all designed to distract from the failures of Ardern's government, and like all hatchet jobs sourced from social media, there was a lynch mob tone to it all. But it backfired on the Labour Party as all their nasties came out, including some appalling racists. Little wonder then the story died as quickly as it surfaced. Ardern wouldn't want her army of trolls to reflect badly on her after their disgusting racist attacks. But it ended quickly too, because Judith Collins is not a cringy apologist who gets to her knees to beg forgiveness from the baying mob. Instead, she battered it all away and told us her man was a proper bloke who plays rugby and is a bit of a larrikin. The outraged continued to shed copious amounts of Liberal tears, but none of those delicious Liberal tears could wash away the nastiness of the racist fans of Jacinda Ardern. We're now entering the election campaign proper. Expect the nasty from the left to continue, especially if their polling shows that the voters are seeing the glitter wash off the turd that this government has become. The media party will scramble and fight tooth and nail to keep Labour in power, but the voters know a scam when they see one. As the job losses mount in coming weeks and more for lease signs adorn empty shops and buildings, people will realise that the sacrifice we were all ordered to make is now affecting them. The wage subsidy was designed to hide the worst effects, but it is now becoming apparent it was merely papering over an economic catastrophe that can only be blamed on the current government. I now believe this election will be a close-run thing. The Labour Party and Jacinda Ardern can only come down from their stratospheric and false highs. Like a meth addict on Monday morning after a weekend bender, they may find the downer coming just too much to bear. One can only hope other voters are wising up to the incompetence of this government before we get to voting day. I'm Cam Slater, and this was Inside Politics.